Today I'm talking to Phil Thomas. He has been a founder member of the Critical Psychiatry Network since its inception and recently was co-chair with Joanna Moncrief. Hi Phil.
Hello Pete.
Right, my first question is, what drew you to training as a psychiatrist originally?
I think there were three things really. The first was at school, in the sixth form. I had to do sciences, but I managed to sneak into A-level English, and the English teacher introduced us to Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. Mm-hmm. And I was completely gobsmacked by that. I'd always been fascinated by dreams and always wondered what they meant. And here I was being told by the teacher that this guy Freud, who I'd sort of vaguely heard about, had this amazing theory about the way the mind worked and all these mechanisms to disguise the meaning of what was, the difference between the latent and the manifest content. Mm-hmm. And I was completely gobsmacked by that. And I think that's one of the things. The other thing that really gobsmacked me about it was the fact that this was in an English lesson. And so it sort of drew me into thinking that perhaps there were ways of thinking about ourselves as human beings that crossed over between the sciences and the humanities, because Freud, of course, was a doctor. He was trained as a neurologist. So that was one thing. The second thing, a year or so later, my first term at medical school in Manchester, we had a series of 6 lectures by the professor of psychology, and in those days that was all the psychology we had. And it was an amazing guy called John Cohen, and I'll never forget this. He introduced us early on to hypnosis. I guess, I don't know, cynically he must have thought, what the hell can I teach sort of first year medical students about psychology? But of course, introducing people to hypnosis is a very powerful way of introducing people to a whole range of complex issues about the mind and our mental worlds. Anyway, what he did was he hypnotized a friend of mine who, how psychologists or hypnotists have all these tricks to find out who's suggestible and who are good subjects for hypnosis. Yeah. So he identified this friend of mine and he put him under the fluence, and I was completely gobsmacked. Better stop using that word, I've used it 5 times already. Anyway, he put him under, and he said, look, it was sort of a warm October afternoon, there's a wasp just come in. And, oh look, he said, it's just landed on the back of your right hand. And, oh gosh, it's just stung you and flown away. And my friend withdrew his hand like that. Now, you may say, well, so what? When he came round, he actually had a sting on he had, the classical triple response, the swelling, the redness, and all the rest of it, like he'd really been stung by a wasp. And I was completely baffled and amazed by that. Of course, there is a perfectly rational naturalistic explanation or physiological explanation that if you stimulate antidromically a sensory nerve, that is, you said normally sensory nerve fibres are afferents, they travel up, but if you intercede somewhere along that chain and send the nerve impulse the other way down, at the site of the end receptor you get histamine released, which of course was the wasp sting. But that got me into thinking about and really interested in the complexity of the relationship between body and mind, and ultimately that got me very much into and interested in philosophy and the problems of dualism, which I've written quite a lot about, especially with Pat Bracken. And thirdly was I started at medical school in 1967, and the next year, 68, of course, was the year of ferment. There were students in the Sorbonne, there were demonstrations. I, with several hundred other students, occupied the I think it was the Whitworth Hall in Manchester, the main sort of hall of the university. And so there was a great deal go. It was a year of turmoil, of ferment, of people beginning to question the established order. And somehow, I don't quite know, it might have been a girlfriend I had in those days, said, you must read this, and she thrust The Divided Self into my hands, and I thought, I looked at it and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. And I went out and bought it, where it remained for several years on my bookshelf, like a sort of, I don't know, an adornment. I hadn't read it, I didn't really know what it was about, although I did later on. It came to be a very important book for me. So I think there were those three things that sort of really got me interested in the mind and the mental and all the rest of it.
Okay, well, and so moving on from that introduction and the sort of genesis of your interest in psychiatry, when did you start to develop a critical perspective of psychiatry?
Right. Well, I think it's probably more accurate to say this is the way I've always been. This is the way I've always thought, and in some respects, I identified very strongly with Loren Moshe 15 years or so ago when he wrote his famous letter of resignation from the American Psychiatric Association, rechristening it the American Psychopharmacological Association. And in that letter he said, sadly this is a case not of me moving away from psychiatry, but psychiatry as I know it has moved away from me. And I think that I'd always been attracted by psychiatry because it was always, when I came in to start my training as a psychiatrist in 1976, when I was still in the Navy as a medical officer, it was still in those days something that was seen to be eclectic. It engaged with and tried to grapple with complexity. It was comfortable with complex moral and ethical discussions and debates about the nature of madness being left open and unresolved. And I found that immensely attractive. And over the years, certainly from when I became a consultant in 1983 and I moved to Manchester, I moved from Netley to Edinburgh where I did the bulk of my psychiatric training. Then in 83 I moved to Manchester, and things began to change in the mid-80s, and it became really very clear to me where things were going in a direction that I wasn't comfortable with when they decided, I think it was in 1989, 1990, to rechristen the Department of Psychiatry in the university in Manchester, the Department of Clinical Neuroscience. And I thought, yeah, that was in 1989, 1990. And
does seem to militate against the complexity of debate and
absolutely.
the humanity almost of it.
And the humanities, because I've always believed passionately that we have so much to learn in working with people who experience psychosis and distress from the humanities. And that's, I hope, clear from the book. So yes, very much so. I think psychiatry itself as a profession over the last 30 years, has moved away from a position where it's comfortable with eclectic views of what madness and distress are, to views that are very much more narrowly focused on brains, genetics, neuroscience and so forth. So I would say I've not changed one iota as a psychiatrist, but I feel that the profession has moved on.
Right. So, very briefly, what is wrong with psychiatry in 2014?
I think there are three main problems, and before I start, I think it's probably fair to say, and important to say, that there are some people who find psychiatry as is currently practiced helpful. You know, some people do gain benefit from having psychiatric diagnoses. Some people say they find some forms of psychiatric drugs, treatments and interventions helpful. So I think I need to sort of, what I'm going to say needs to be said within that context.
Okay, yes, I understand that.
But many people, probably the majority of people who end up seeing psychiatrists, don't find what psychiatrists do terribly helpful. And I think, first of all, is the problem that arises from the way in which psychiatry or psychiatrists try to interpret and make sense of distress and psychosis through the idea that these experiences are caused or brought about by faulty mechanisms, either faulty mechanisms in people's brains, if you're a neuroscientist, or in their minds, if you're a cognitive scientist or a cognitive a cognitivist, let's put it that way. And this sort of focuses the problems of distress and psychosis very much in the individual. And in fact, there's no evidence at all, certainly as far as neuroscience is concerned, there's no convincing evidence that brain disorders are important in a single psychiatric diagnosis, with the exception of dementias, which arguably anyway are neurological disorders. The second problem arises from that. Because these are searches for the causes of psychosis located in the individual, it completely neglects and ignores or downplays the importance and relevance of a wide range of different contexts in understanding psychosis and distress. And these are contexts within which the lives of individuals who have these experiences are lived. And the first thing to say about that is that there is a huge amount of absolutely first-class scientific research from epidemiology, from psychologists like John Reed and others, that shows very, very clearly how important contexts, childhood adversity, racism, and direct personal experiences of racial abuse and harassment are directly linked to the experiences of psychosis. And that raises, for me, as somebody who's interested in trying to understand people's experiences, a whole set of moral and ethical issues about what does it mean to be a good practitioner? And for me, the answer to that question is to be found in ways that primarily are to do with engaging with those contexts, recognizing them, listening to people's stories about them, bearing witness to them. Now, that's of course not to say that you can be that is not to say that you can only do that if you're not a biological psychiatrist. I'm not making that claim at all. Many psychiatrists of a biological persuasion do that. But the problem in the profession as a whole, I think, is the way in which the biological aspects of our lives as human beings are seen to be preeminent and most important. So, and therefore, it tends to downplay the importance of those contexts. The third thing, I think, again, also arises from just the natural progression from one thing to another. The problem, it seems to me, with technological interventions, drugs or ECT or even forms of technical therapies, is that they overlook the extent to which human relationships, hope and meaning are really important in helping people to recover, or if you like, to heal people after their experiences of psychosis. And I mean, this became abundantly clear in the editorial which about 29 of us published in the British Journal of Psychiatry in December 2012. And we set these sort of three aspects out in some detail. And you can see very clearly how the three are linked to the lack of evidence for the effectiveness of psychiatric drugs, and the fact that what we call non-specific factors, the human relationship factors, the placebo effect, if you like, are the most important determinants of outcome.
In that sense, what you're saying resonates strongly with movements in psychotherapy, understanding common factors, as we would say, and realising that the efforts of the therapist actually take second place to the life and efforts of the person suffering the distress.
Absolutely.
It's taken us all a long time to wake up to that, hasn't it?
I think it's something we're rediscovering. I remember a lovely little book I read. It was on required reading when I was a trainee in psychiatry by Sidney Block, who was a psychotherapist based in Oxford. And it was just called An Introduction to the Psychotherapies, and he made that point beautifully in that book. This was in the late 70s, early 80s, that actually he was saying, and this was before the days of evidence-based practice. This was from his own sort of personal clinical experience, together with his own understanding of the outcome research, such as it was in those days. And he made this point very powerfully, if I remember correctly in that book, that it was the common elements, the human elements, the qualities of the therapist, the nature of the therapeutic relationship, all those were the important aspects of in terms of outcome in psychotherapy, and indeed across the whole of psychiatry. And it seems to me very silly that we're at the point of rediscovering that now in the 2014, whenever it is, when after all this evidence-based research, it's something that was known a long time ago. And indeed the dodo bird effect, the idea that all will have won and all shall have prizes, that goes back to the 1930s. So it has a very long tradition.
It does. So again, very briefly, how can that be put right? How can psychiatry as a profession turn itself around? What needs to happen?
I think that's a really difficult question, and it's probably, I don't know, it's probably one best not left for me to answer, because I'm no longer practicing. I haven't practiced for 10 years or so. But I've always felt, certainly since this change I referred to in the 1980s, this increasing sort of commitment, this zeal for biology, but one of the things that was really important was that a shift from hubris to humility. And the reason I say that is that I think that, and the person who describes this beautifully is Arthur Frank in his book The Wounded Storyteller, where he talks about restitution narratives. And the whole idea in psychiatry now is that if we just get the biology right, if we get the science right, we'll get the right treatments and we can cure madness. Now, I think that leads to a very overinflated view about what it is possible for us to do as doctors for people who experience psychosis and distress, which is why I say I think there's a real need for a shift from hubris to humility. And I think that requires really strong leadership right from the top of the profession, from the new president, Simon Wesley. And I wish him well in that task, but I think that's what is needed. Whether or not we'll get it remains to be seen. I think the second thing that needs to happen is that there needs to be much greater attention paid in the training and education of psychiatrists to the importance of non-specific aspects of care. And how do you achieve that? Well, you can achieve that in a number of ways. You can achieve it by exposing